What do you guys want to talk about? What do you guys want to chat about today?
Race and class. And it feels like that's the thing that is the most touchy. It feels like that's the thing that gets people the most emotional. And it feels like that's the thing, or that's the reason why that's the thing I want to address in this first sort of section of this. So let's listen. This guy is a Harvard researcher, and he did some research, and he wrote a book, or they're calling it a pamphlet or something like that, an essay, because it's not necessarily a book, but it's an essay on race and class, and I believe it's called something like "How to Achieve Racial Liberation Through Class Struggle." So if your goal is to achieve some of those racial sort of liberating things, is the way to get that through class struggle or racial struggle. We see what racial struggle has gotten us, and it feels like we've reaching a ceiling to me. But let's listen to what this guy said, and I must say he is a Marxist. So, and that is the perspective of the, that we mostly come from. So that's the reason why I wanted to play this first.
Big question. It's about a lot of things. I think one of the way that we start the essay is we observe that any good leftist, any good egalitarian in this society, in the United States, and in many other racially divided societies, has to be concerned about racial equality. There's something really scandalous about the fact that just by virtue of your arbitrary assignment into a racial group, you live worse in so many different dimensions of life. That has to outrage us. The question for any egalitarian then, of course, is how do we fight that? How do we change it? How do we close the racial gap between, in the essay we talk specifically about white Americans and black Americans, but the argument could be generalized. And when you do that, when you think about, okay, how should we close the racial gap, you have to think politically. You have to think strategically. What would it mean to close the racial gap? And one of the very, very obvious challenges for any American egalitarian who seeks to close the racial gap is that the ways in which we know how to transform the United States, transform capitalist societies in general, all depend on having either a majority of the population behind your policy proposal, behind your campaign, which you would do through democratic means, or a majority of the working class behind your policy campaign, which you might do through unions and disruptive campaigns. And the obvious problem, if that's the case, if that's how you're going to transform America, is that Black Americans and non-white Americans in general are a minority of both the population and the working class. And so you confront what we call just the fatal limit of demography in the United States.
So let's talk about that, the fatal limit of demography. Do you think, and I'm going to ask all of you, do you think we've reached that? Have trying to access more freedoms through convincing people based on the argument based off of some race issue, have we reached the limit of the effectiveness that can gain with the civil rights movement? Have we seen something more? In other words, if we could gain more through that way, why haven't we gained more since the signing of the civil rights legislation? So all of that wrapped into one. I'll start with Nick first. Go ahead, Nick.
I'll pass it to Rome, but to make
whoever. I thought you were just.
To make it real simple, because I know Rome wanted to chime in. Neoliberalism. I wrote my first Substack article I wrote about this, on how our Black community, Black elders, led by sellouts like John Lewis, the Black Congressional Caucus, the new leaders, Hakeem Jeffries, they took our old revolutionary mindset, meaning the Black Panthers, which is a Marxist-Leninist organization, right? Why you guys wonder why RBN don't shy away from our socialist and Marxist and communist labels, despite the fact that may help hurt us on YouTube? Because that comes from our Black revolutionary background. MLK was a socialist. Malcolm X said, if you're a capitalist, you're a fucking rat. You're a worm. You're a parasite. Once again, Black Panther is a Marxist-Leninist organization. Marx developed his theory behind capitalism based on looking how European societies and cultures relied on slave labor, and despite the massive wealth that they got by stealing the wealth of Africans and South Americans and many other indigenous people, despite this massive wealth, they had a giant amount of people in poverty. So Marx led a critique of the Western societies based on this principle. Then he looked at indigenous cultures. He looked at how Africans lived. He looked at how indigenous Hawaiians live, how people in Central America live. These people have way less resources than European countries, but they're happier. They raising families. They take care of each other. They living longer. He's like, how is that possible? And that would led to the theory of the theory of Marxism and socialism that we follow, that MLK, Malcolm X, and Fred Hampton pick up on. You want to know what they are now? They're neoliberal capitalists. And people wondering why the Black community is in the state that they're in right now. We have a ton of Black millionaires running around, but the racial income inequality is worse than it's ever been. It's worse than it was at the height of the civil rights movement, fam. You guys know that? So my question is that me playing identity politics by bringing up this class issue? The class issue that we are in a worse economic position than we was in the 60s. Is that identity politics? Fam, is it? It's not. That's a class issue. And there's civil asset forfeiture. There's the amount of wealth that is stolen by our state. I was a victim of the bankruptcy bill. I would charge a higher interest rate on my car loan, proven by a lawsuit, fam. And that was only because Joe Biden and Democratic Party loosened regulations and allowed the banks to discriminate on Black people and made it so that they pay a higher cost of living than white people. So meanwhile, Black neoliberals are teaming up with these people, and they wonder why, oh my God, why are racial struggling failing? One word, neoliberalism. I went long. I apologize. I passed it wrong. I went way longer than I planned, but Ron, go ahead. Because there's a lot to break down there. I'll share my thoughts later.
And you're right, because it seemed like we did reach a ceiling here. And, education is always key. And this is something that they have been holding back from all of our communities, whether they be Black or white. Whether you have good education or bad education, you still have been programmed to be the person that you are today. You have been programmed to not rebel against the system, to work in the factories, to do whatever they needed you to do, to not revolt. In order not to revolt, keep you distracted and keep you dumb. This is why we have reached the ceiling that our heads are touching right now when it comes to Black and whites actually coming together to get something done when it comes to class issues. Because once again, we can't leave out, how Black people go through things, how Black people lives are treated in America. If we are talking on class, because if you guys, there's a lot of white leftists that say ACAB. Why are all cops bad? Why? Right? Because of the things that they do to these communities, and you cannot avoid it. Right? So it is a class issue, and the education people have been deprived from. This is one of the reasons why we're not in the space that we need to be right now.
So before I pass back to Pound, this is my first ever Substack article to answer this question, right? Embrace MLK, reject Barack Obama. Why leftists need to challenge the scourge of Black neoliberalism. Black boomers have led our generation off a cliff by embracing neoliberalism. Voting for Hakeem Jeffries in New York. Shame on you. Supporting Hakeem Jeffries. Make sure you got to check this out.
Let's pause, Nick, to introduce Sabby here, because we want to get her feeling. What's up, Sabs?
I feel like it's very clear to me that even after 2 Bernie Sanders campaigns in a row, on the left, we still don't understand, or not all of us, but it seems like there's a general consensus where a lot of people don't understand that for those of us that are Black, especially working class Black people, we only have class and we're not going to focus on race. We have to deal with both. And I think what some people may not understand is that, and I have a video clip I can show to CJ. some of the racist policies and laws that were implemented in this country to prevent Black people from getting ahead or to stop Black people ultimately ended up hurting poor and working class white people as well. And I'll show you guys the video whenever you're ready, because I want to show you an example of this. And this is why we can't just say, oh, we're just going to focus on class, not talk about race.
Yeah, let's hold the video, because there is a spot where, yeah, there is a spot in this after we get to this, where we can present that. Because anyway, let me play the video and you'll get what I mean. Because I don't want to give it away what's said. I didn't get a chance to. I don't think all of you saw this video and some of the points he's going to make. And I think there will be a more natural placement for that video. You'll see, Sabi. And so let's listen to this here.
Black Americans and non-white Americans in general are a minority of both the population and the working class. And so you confront what we call just the fatal limit of demography in the United States. It's very, very difficult, impossible, really, to build a race-specific coalition to attack racial inequality. We then say, okay, well, if that's the case, is the situation hopeless? Is there nothing we can do? And we observe that, no, that's not the case, precisely because African Americans are overrepresented amongst the poor and overrepresented in the working class. You can also attack racial inequality in the United States by attacking class inequality, by attacking income inequality. And unlike racial inequality, unlike race-based strategies, class-based strategies actually are viable, because majorities of the population and majorities of the working class have an interest in closing the class gap. And so the class path, what we call the class path, becomes a viable path to racial liberation, racial equality in the United States in a way that the race-based path can never be. One thing that we can observe when we look at the United States is that African Americans are worse off than white Americans, not just in that they have, on average, less income, not just that they have less wealth, but also that they're stigmatized in our culture, that in our social life, in politics, they're much less likely to have power, et cetera. So there are a wide variety of domains of social life in which African Americans are worse off than white Americans. Now, one challenge when you then are trying to think of a program of racial equality is you have to think, okay, well, what kind of strategy could address simultaneously all of these different dimensions? And it seems like there's probably none. We'd have to prioritize. And so in thinking about which to prioritize, we want to think about what the relationship is between these different domains of inequality. And one of the things that Dave and I argue in the essay is that it seems reasonable to commit to what we call the materialist wager, which is the idea that economic inequalities, income and wealth inequalities principally, have a kind of asymmetric relationship between these other domains. Not to say that these other domains don't affect income and wealth inequality, but income and wealth inequality have an outsized effect in the other direction. And if that's true, then it is rational for egalitarians to focus on inequalities in income and wealth. I think of that point as just a basic point that most socialists probably already understand intuitively, but it's something that's worth stating explicitly. The reason that we focus on income and wealth is because these things have an outsized impact on how people fare in all domains of social life. It's not necessarily because we care more about income inequality than any other kind of inequality. It's because income inequality and wealth inequality are the key to transforming. In the essay, we only talk about income, but the same thing is true of wealth, is that within race, income inequality has become so significant, so large in the United States, that within, if you just look at Black America, so in the essay, we look at working age men who are Black. If you just look at them, income inequality amongst Black working age men in the United States is as unequal, roughly, as the country of Colombia, the Latin American country of Colombia. It's just, the Gini coefficient is 0.5, for if that means anything to people. It's just a very, very unequal income distribution. And the white income distribution is similar. I can't remember exactly the number, but it's around that. And both are very close to the overall level of inequality. Now, what all of that implies, as we try to show in the piece, is that if you're a poor Black person, the gap between you and a poor white person is much, much smaller than the gap between you and a rich Black person. And you can think in a stylized way, you can think of race race-based politics is trying to basically close the gap between you and white people. So take the poor black person and make their life equivalent to a poor white person. And class-based politics is trying to close the gap between you and a rich black person. And it turns out that in the United States today, the gap between you, as I was saying, you and a rich black person is just much, much larger. Something like, depending on which points you pick, it's about 7 to 8 times larger, we show. So what that means is that class-based politics just stands to transform your life in a way that race-based politics can't. The gap between you and a poor white person is just not that large. So if you lived like them, your life wouldn't be all that different. Now, if you go and think about the interests of the rich black person, they stand to benefit quite a bit from race-based politics because they live worse than the rich white person. The 85th percentile black person lives worse than the 85th percentile white person. Whites are advantaged. But class-based politics actually works in the opposite direction because they live above the average. They live above the median. So any effort to bring them closer to the poor is going to be deleterious to their interests. And so you start to see that, in fact, there's a kind of class gradient in who is attracted to race-based politics and who's attracted to class-based politics, even within the black community. Basically, class-based politics just does much more for the black poor, while race-based politics does much more for the black rich. Now, that's not to say that race-based politics wouldn't do anything for the poor black person. It would move them to the position of the poor white person. But it is just interesting to note that it does the relative preferences are reversed.
Even on crime and police, the solutions help. Yeah, this is the point. Mosaic gets the point. The solutions help all people, white, black, etc. You specify race, though, it causes division. Why is that? So the question we got to ask is, why is that?
Because the lack of
when we
education.
talk about black issues and someone is turned off, the question is why? Why are you turned off? Because if you turned off when we talk about something very significant, like the state of black wealth, you are going to get in the way of the revolution and the movement later on, correct? So we might as well iron the issues out right now. Like why push something down the road that's going to be a problem later, right? So this is what I don't understand, and this is the point.
This is the reason why left movements lack black people and black leadership, because of being ignored, being put on the back burner. Why do you think these black people move far away from you leftists, you online leftists? You don't see a lot of black people saying that they are communists or whatever the fuck, because they have been ignored and pushed to the back, not only by Republicans, Democrats, now socialists and communists and leftists. So when do we get a chance to speak on the podium? When do we get a chance to speak on it? Because if we're going to talk about all issues, then we're going to talk about all issues because all of them affect us way harder than it would ever affect a white family.
And these are some of the same issues that people had with Bernie Sanders' campaign, where it felt like when it came to the discussion of reparations, and Bernie Sanders said that he does not support reparations. Even Nina Turner tried to tell him back then, like, no, you need to have that as part of your platform. He said multiple times in interviews he did not agree with it. This is also why some people in the black community wouldn't want to fuck with Bernie Sanders. Because the thing is, like, this idea that if we give everybody these universal policies, it lifts all boats, right? But I think there's a difference between looking at equality and equity. And that's, even for me with the Bernie campaign, Bernie Sanders missed that part. Just because you're lifting all boats, that still doesn't mean that some people are still going to be at the bottom. And that's the thing. You lift all boats with those universal policies, but black people would still be at the bottom. And that's what people don't understand. If you're trying to close the racial wealth gap, you're not going to close it just by universal policies.
Mm-hmm. And one thing what I don't understand with the objection that race is separated from class. Because that's our argument, is that race and class are connected. I did many streams with Dr. Peter Hotesh and many of the amazing thinkers at Bedbeat Media and many internationalists, where we agree on ending war. We agree on ending Wall Street greed. We agree on increasing the wages of our household, giving each other health care. So we agree on those class issues, right? So let's get back to his comment. Imagine how silly you are if you like, yeah, the Ukraine war is a big issue. We're on the cusp of World War III. Let's start an anti-war movement. Let's work together to end this. And then you hear a black leftist say something about white supremacy, and now you're like, Oh, never mind. I don't want to. Fuck it. I don't care no more. I don't want to organize with them to end war. That's what you guys are saying.
Because what do a hit dog do? If you punch the shit out of a dog, what would it?
You guys don't want to work. Oh, hold on, Rome. You guys are saying that you guys don't want to work with people on ending war, on increasing our material interests, just because they mention critical race theory. That is what you guys are okaying. Because when you guys say, well, you can't talk about race issues because it will turn off some white people, you guys are okaying the white guy leaving the movement because of nonsense. Why is that the red line for you guys? You guys see, why are you guys splitting and separating class solidarity? Because we talk about white supremacy and we talk about how this society is not as good as you think it is. You hurt our feelings, so we don't want to work with you no more. That's bullshit. That is deeply unserious, childish shit. At the end of the day, and I have no tolerance for that. Oh, Nick, you hurt my feelings. My great dad, he didn't benefit from white supremacy. Our generational wealth had nothing to do with slavery. Because you hurt my feelings, I don't care about the Ukraine war no more. That is what you guys sound like to me.